So this is my first book, Ancestral. It just came out in September. I've actually just finished writing a whole other book for another publisher, and it's going to be coming out next year. Very different sort of book though, but still part of the same process for me. So, I have a podcast myself, Essence. It's very niche, but it's particularly in speaking to other authors from the publishers that I work with and kind of in this sphere. And one of the resounding things that often we say, and I've heard this myself coming out of my own mouth, is that any book that we write, particularly nonfiction, but also fiction too, is always going to be a snapshot of who we were at that moment, right? When we're writing it, go 10 years, and you'll be a very different person. You'll be a different writer, right? So I often find that people come to me, they want to know, tell me about your publishing journey. How do you get published? All that, right? And one of the biggest issues and hang-ups is they feel like they have to make it perfect. They have to absolutely make everything perfect the first go, especially if they've not gone through a writing process before. And I was the same per time. I had the same issue where I think with this one, I spent about 8 months for an 86,000 word book. 8 months, which really isn't, for perspective, I just wrote a 180,000 word source book in 3 months. Really evolution of writing process there. But the first one, it was because I was freaking out. I was constantly thinking, what do I need to do? How do I need to change this? I was editing as I went, all this and all the other. The cool thing with publishing, particularly a traditional publishing journey, is that you have editors who are going to help you with that. So the most important thing is to just get stuff down, put it out there, get because you're going to have other editing processes after that. There's so many pieces. You're going to have to jump in and guide me on what we can talk about here. There's so many.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. And, I get to travel the world with a microphone and headphones and talk to authors around the world. And I got to tell you, sometimes you meet somebody and you're like, this is the weirdest thing ever. My guest today is on the podcast. He's not weird, but the situations and circumstances of how we know and where we've been and how we've kind of crossed paths without knowing each other. It's amazing. So a little background on my guest. Ben has got connections with my wife, Jennifer, and her family. Ben also has connections with me and where I grew up. And he also has a connection with someone who lives where I live today. And it's like this all came from a post in a Facebook group or something, and we all met through this way. And it's just this synchronicity of all this stuff coming together, fitting together like a nice little puzzle. And here I am with Ben Stimpson on the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here, Ben. And again, you're still making my mind wobble as I kind of try to process all of these connection pieces we have. But welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our conversations today. I know it's weird when you meet people and get talking, you never know who you're going to meet, right?
I love it. And you had a great example. You're on a bus. You're in the UK. You're having a conversation. Tell us what happened in that situation. I love it.
Well, it's kind of weird. Go back 14 years and I was working in the UK. I'm originally from the United Kingdom, but I grew up here in Canada. And I had a chance to work at a satellite campus for a Canadian university in their student services department for a summer. It was like, oh, this is amazing. I get to go home, take a load of Canadian students and show them home, right? So I'm on a coach, and it's kind of that study abroad sort of thing. So you do weekend events. We go all over the place. So I'm sat with one of the professors, and I think he was one of the history professors. We were going to Canterbury Cathedral or somewhere like that. And so I get chatting to him because I hadn't really talked to him before. And I said, oh, so where are you from over in Canada? Because he's Canadian. And he said, oh, I'm from this little tiny place called Durham. And I said, oh, Oshawa, Whitby, where about? Oh, no. He said, no, not Durham region, a town called Durham, Ontario. And I said, right next to Hanover, right? And he said, you know Hanover? I said, I went to school in Hanover. Hanover is the next town, 10 minutes over from Durham. So it turns out that his brother had come into my parents' shop at times and weirdest little things,
Yeah. my wife's family is really close to Neustadt, and we
Yeah.
drive through there all the time to go visit them. So it's just amazing, right? When
You
the
never
world
know.
is so big yet so small,
Yeah.
and your book kind of touches on this little thing that we're seeing happen between you and myself, and you and the person on the bus. You kind of talk about this in your book. Can we just start with that? Like, how do you kind of address that in your book?
So my book is, and I'll hold it up just for image reasons.
Yeah.
So my book is Ancestral Whispers, a guide to building ancestral veneration practices. So it's a spirituality book. I write in the metaphysics area, and the book is really about that kind of spiritual connection between each other and to the dead. And that piece around that weird, and I like that word weird, the old spelling of weird, WYRD, is the northern Scandinavian concept of fate and destiny, right? And it's those interconnections, those synchronicities, fate that bring people together. And oftentimes in my experience and through folklore, a lot of my background is in folklore and history and things like that, you see these stories of coincidences happen all the time. And we have Hallmark movies all about it, right? Like,
Right.
The ancestor of a great-grandma, of a dead great-grandmother, bringing two people together and healing, all these things. So I often like to think that that we are connected in many, many different ways. And it's kind of neat when you start to look at those connections. I know in Indian Bollywood movies, this is a huge thing, the whole test of time kind of thing, or, through karmic connections, people were in love in different lives in the past and then they re-meet in this, a really interesting trope of Indian media there.
Wow.
But it's neat. So how I look at it in my book and how I work with it in my book is that idea of relationship, and that relationship expands outwards to those kind of hidden metaphysical spaces. I'm a therapist in my regular life too. Carl Jung talked a lot about this idea of synchronicity, this idea of physically feeling those connections. So, whenever you've had a weird coincidence happen and you just get those feeling, that's that type of physical, metaphysical kind of sensation. So I talk a great deal about that and picking up on those cues and working on those cues.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Okay. So not only do we have connections about geographics and you knowing parts of where I'm from, we also then have the actual feeling of your book happening in real time as we have the conversation. And I have that feeling right now. Like I'm like, this is so weird. This is so amazing that we're having a conversation about the thing that's happening to me while we have the conversation about how we're connected. All of these things fitting together in our conversation.
Yeah.
I'm kind of, what is it, flabbergasted? That's a good word, right?
A freaky feeling, isn't it?
Right?
I know. It's weird. It's like those weird moments where, and like one of my favorite examples of this is a Chinese couple. It was in the news a few years ago. This Chinese couple were flipping through old family photos, and they came across this photo of the husband 20 years before visiting this tourist site in like Yunnan or somewhere in South China. And the wife was shocked because in the picture, and it's him standing in front of the statue. I think it was a statue of like Buddha or something like that. You can see her in the background.
No. What?
They didn't even know each other. And when she pulled out her picture from that day, you could see him in the background. And they didn't know each other. They were completely like from two different parts of China. And they just so happened to meet a few years later through colleagues. And it's like, I can send you the link later on. I can send you the news story.
What?
What are the odds?
Right? Yeah. So, okay, when you hear that kind of stuff, Ben, what goes off in your mind? My mind just gets like overwhelmed. But I think you have a very thoughtful approach to this, and what you're in a different space than I am as far as knowledge, and I'm here to learn from you. So what goes off in your mind? Is it kind of a check and balance? Like, yep, that makes sense. That can really happen.
It's those interconnections. So I'm a strong believer in Jung's synchronicity, but I'm also a strong believer in, spiritual connections. I come from various different backgrounds. Again, one of my favorite kind of concepts is the Scandinavian concept of weird. And how that's usually visualized is, I mean, I can show you, but your audience won't be able to see it. But it's nine staves that crisscross to create a grid pattern. And it's this idea that we as individuals are connected. Not only are we connected biologically because we have two parents who have two parents who have two parents, and so on and so on and so on, but we're also connected through all sorts of other means, right? We're connected socially, we're connected emotionally, there's all these intangible connections. And so for me, it totally makes sense on a soul purpose, in a spiritual sense, that we would be connected in different ways outside of these individual forms that we're taking. So for me, I feel like there are these connections going out, and we can often feel in a way when something is happening or when something's about to happen. It's those moments, and I think everybody experiences this, premonitions, right? When you know something big is about to happen, or something is just about to happen, and then of course in retrospect you put all those pieces together. I've experienced that in my own life. I feel like we all do too. We get those hunches. That's where that gut feeling comes in. When you get a hunch about something and it turns out later on that you're right? I feel like, again, that speaks to the sixth sense, if you will, right? That understanding of something else is going on outside of the five senses that we're able to conceptualize. And I've certainly experienced that in my own life. How my book is kind of focused is picking up on those connections from an ancestral place. So working with ancestral spirits, our dead, and the communication that's happening between us as living beings and them as dead beings. But the same thing can be true for other forms of spiritual being, other forms of relationship, right?
Wow. Okay, so I'm finding this extremely fascinating.
I hope so. I never know how it's going to come across, to be honest. So
I want some examples, though. I want some stories. We all love stories, so I'm going to sit back and enjoy. But Ben, can you give us some examples of what we're talking about here? I want to go deep in this. Come on.
Yeah, absolutely, I can. Part of these I actually talk about in the book, and it's a part of my own healing journey. So I'll give you an example. 2016, I had 7 men come back into my life who were either I was in love with at one point, or we were really good friends, or there was some connection. There was still unfinished business between us. And every single time these individuals came back, like they would just appear in the most weirdest of ways. I would always start to get this anxious feeling. Like every couple of months, I would start getting this anxious feeling, like something's happening, like that feeling of, when a storm is coming and you get that kind of electricity in your body. I started to feel that. And of course, it has the concept of synchronicity is that there's no direct causation between two things that we can understand. In retrospect, it makes sense, but in the moment, one thing does not necessarily directly connect with another. So I'm like, I'm starting to get anxious. I'm starting to feel something. And then the person would appear. One of the first examples was I was doing a psychic fair. Such a cliche thing to do, talking about this, right? I'm doing a psychic fair. I'm vending it at a psychic fair in Kitchener. And of course, I live about an hour and a half north. And where I originally went to school was in Toronto years and years and years ago. I did a college course in Toronto. And there was a guy I met back then. We slept together. We kind of knew each other for a few months. And then we kind of parted ways and we didn't really talk much, right? So I'm sitting in the hotel room in Kitchener, and I pull out one of the apps and I'm like, let's see who's, in town, whatever. So this guy messages me on there and he doesn't have a profile picture. And I don't normally talk to people who don't have profile pictures. It's just, whatever, right? So I start chatting to him. And so he's really interested in that kind of thing. And he comes to the psychic fair the next day, and I recognize him. He was the person who I had met all those years before. And as soon as he saw me, he was like, oh my God, like, what are you doing here, right? Like, randomest moment of connection. And he said, I've been really thinking about you lately. randomly out of blue. When he met me, when we knew each other, he was in a really bad place with his mental health, and just kind of hanging out with me and having that little thing that we had for those few months really meant a big thing for him. And he wanted to tell me, but he didn't know how to connect with me or whatever, right? So not in a baby reindeer sort of stalking way, but there was no like I kind of popped into his head just recently because something triggered that. And then suddenly he had this need to connect with me and blah, there we were, right? I hadn't seen him for like 10 years. So, and stuff like that continued to happen over and over again. The weirdest one was one of the absolute huge individuals in my life. My best friend when I was in university years ago, with a falling out, didn't really work out, and I pined for him for years and years and years. It was a bit of an unrequited love sort of situation, and he didn't feel the same way. And we had a falling out, and it was very emotionally damaging for both of us. So I had moved to Hamilton because I was starting to look to doing school in Toronto again, training in psychotherapy. And at the end of 2016, I reconnected with him online. I found him online again. I reconnected with him, and it didn't really go anywhere. Just a few comments here and there, and nothing. I had no idea where he was. I thought maybe he was in, another province or down in the States somewhere, and I just put it out of my head. So it turns out when I started to do my practicum a year and a half later, I found out he was in Hamilton, and I found out that where his office was, because he also trained in psychotherapy too, where his office was just around the corner from where I was living. I had no idea, right? When I took my office on, it turns out that he was seeing the therapist whose office was right next door to mine in the same row, right?
Right. Wow.
It was going to be a situation where we were going to have to run into each other eventually, right? And we eventually did, and we had a long healing journey around that, and I think we're both in really good places because of that, because we had a lot, both of us had stuff to let go. But it's like, how do you explain that? And how kind of my journey around the ancestral work around that piece, a lot of the stuff I explored in my psychotherapy program was kind of family patterns, family stories, and I had to do family history research. And going back into 5 generations into the past to explore those stories, how that it kind of came into my own life and how that seeped into our family culture, right? And one of the big messages from that year was stop living in the past. You don't belong there. Live to the future. That's really the turning point for my life. And when I started to take ownership of my life again, because I was really in a really bad place in 2015. Between 2010 and 2015, it was not a great time in my life. So yeah, it's the weirdest thing. And every single time it was almost like, again, I could feel storm clouds on the horizon. I knew something was coming, no idea. The wind would change. It's the weirdest things. So
wow.
I hope that those are good examples.
It does. It does. I can identify with that so much. And I guess partly I've never really sat down and kind of mapped it out the way you just did. And it does give a lot of clarity to that, because I felt that many times. It's like something's off, like something's weird. Like, am I having a bad day, or why do I feel like
something's
this?
in the air, something's happening. Yeah. What I learned with this, and I work a lot with this in a spiritual sense now, is learning to understand that feeling so that I don't get in the way of whatever it is. It's almost like, I imagine almost like, there's something going on behind a curtain. I know something's happening behind a curtain, but it's not for me to look at, right? I know that it's going to impact my life. So I have to determine, do I go the right course of action? Do I make a decision right now? And I feel like when people get into those really huge, momentous decisions, there's like that split second of, there's something big needing to be done right now. What do I do? And, life-changing decision. So it's learning to know, okay, do I do something or do I not do anything right now, and just let things happen? Because we often get in our own way, especially when we feel really small. And moments like this can really make us feel really, really small because, big momentous things are happening and we don't have control in it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I see how all these things play out and all of these connection pieces, it just makes me more aware that this is not just some random roll of the dice, our life. There's something directing our path, right? And for people, they have different opinions of what that is and different beliefs, but there's something. There's something bigger. There's something happening. There's something happening behind the scenes. We're not just the author of our own destiny as much as we want to be. There's something going on, and we just need to be more aware of it and open to that, I guess, in the direction, right?
I would say so. Yeah, you become more sensitive to it, right? You become more sensitive to when you're expected to be an active agent and when you're expected to just, sit down and STF you, Like, and I think that's why I like the idea of the Scandinavian concept of weird, because it's the main image of it is like the weaving of a tapestry. But the weaving happens immediately. It's happening now, all the time. Everything that we do, we have agency in that weave, right? Very different from fatalism in kind of a Christian or classical concept, where you have this one deity who's making everything happen.
Yeah.
This idea of the weave constantly happening. It's an unfolding. And so, like, if you, read, like, the Icelandic sagas, for example, or any of, like, the old Germanic style poetry, Beowulf is a good example of this, right? You've got premonitions and omens throughout that literature. And those premonitions are there to be kind of like, not doorways to pass through, but like little knocks on the head, like, this, you need to pay attention here, or, you need to move out of the way here. Right. And that's, one of my big things is kind of Icelandic culture and Scandinavian culture and English culture. And that is the sense of heroism there. Is that idea of heroism is not necessarily what you do, but how you do it. And so if events are unfolding and you feel out of control, you relinquish that control to some kind of external force, then depending upon what that thing is, you would be seen as either a coward or as somebody who's rising up, So it's an interesting kind of thing. It's being an active agent in your own destiny, if you will. But sometimes being an active agent is, again, knowing when not to do something and when to do something, right?
Okay, so how does your book then help us as a guide on our path through this discussion? Like, what was your big idea behind the book, and kind of like, who did you have in mind when you're writing this?
Of course. So the book and it's very niche. I'll be honest, it's very niche. I know you have all of your guests from very niche genres, but the concept of the book originally started. I started writing it in the pandemic. So I started laying it down in 2020 and then really started writing it in 2021. And it emerged out of that project that I had done in my psychotherapy training, which was the family history piece, the understanding yourself as an extension of your family story and all of these people who had come before. But I was also working from it around the idea of relationship, right? So how this book helps that is helping us to become the best kind of individuals that we can potentially be by putting us back into relationship with those allies, whether living or dead, to really put us into that place of being able to be active agents in our lives, as opposed to just letting things happen all the time. If that makes sense. So the movie Coco is a really good example of this. Okay. This is one of the reasons why I wrote it in this way. In the kind of metaphysical niche that I write in, the pagan community, the spiritual community, the great interest in ancestor work, because there is so many things that we're living with now in the world that came from those contexts, right? We don't come into the world with a blank slate. We're literally in the context that was created last generation before that, generation before that. And part of my work or part of my academic background is actually medieval studies. So I know that the things we're dealing with right now, all the instability in the world, the political climate, right, the way that people are reacting to things like the pandemic, and that's happened again and again and again over the past few centuries. And when you think of time in that way as constantly being cyclical, you begin to understand then that we're not so different from them, right? But it's cyclical because there's something in our human culture and the way that humans perpetuate those things that it's going to come back again and again and again. right? So the climate change issue that we're dealing with right now, right? We can see that in the 80s and the 70s and 60s, they knew that. And of course, back in the 1800s, early 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution started, right, it comes again and again. So we're coming into this context. The way that we move forward with our lives is not to just be like, I'm not looking at my ancestors. I don't, becoming aware of them and the history that they've perpetuated and the context that we live in now so that we can make informed decisions. And one way of doing that is actually having a relationship, a spiritual relationship with them. So the movie Coco is a really good example of that. The family, because of what was happening 5 generations before between Mama Imelda and Hector, right? Mm-hmm. And that whole break, suddenly music is not something that can happen in the family. That trauma from that breakup is still in the family and dictating the family, right? So what does Hector do? He comes back into relationship with his great-great-great-grandmother and great-great-great-grandfather and brings them back together again. And there's a healing that happens at that level that filters down into the life and the living world. And that's what this sort of form of spirituality is all about too, is learning those stories, having a direct relationship now, as opposed to just working with the ancestors through the stories that you've been told. So there's all sorts of various kind of spiritual practices and rituals and things that one can do. But it's that knowing, it's that internal immanency of knowing that they are, or at least through this belief system, knowing that the ancestors and the dead are still there. Part of it is also understanding our own legacy piece too, knowing that we will eventually be dead. And so it's preparing us to be those ancestors to the ones who are coming in the future.
Now, if you're listening to this and you didn't realize how deep we were going to go, that's deep. That on my mind.
Just wait until we start talking about writing processes. It's going to get even deeper.
I love it. No, I love it. I love it, Ben. Wow. Like, as a history person, I love anything to do with history. I love chasing my roots back. My roots are back in Scotland. So I love kind of following that path. But I see what you're talking about, how that all those stories and all those lived experiences carry forward, right? But then your point about not living in the past as well.
Exactly.
Right? Is kind of balancing the two. Right.
It's balancing the two, right? A lot of people, I think, and this is a particularly an issue with Western culture, particularly an issue with Protestant Western culture, because Catholicism and Orthodoxy have this sense about the dead, right? Most of human cultures and traditions around the world have this sense about the dead being still a part of the universe. I think Protestant Western kind of capitalist culture has removed us from that, because oftentimes people will scoff, spirits or ghosts or blah, 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 right? And that's not a norm when you look around the world. Most humans around the world, most of the 8 billion of us, still believe in spiritual beings. And even in the type of language I just used there, right? Still believe. Right? Yeah. It's ingrained. It's really ingrained in us. So that, and we can see that in the breakdown of families, in family connections, even in the understanding of kind of what constitutes a family, right? We're so individualistic in so many ways. And I feel like there's a real pushback to want to reinvigorate that idea of family in whatever way that family looks, whether it be, like a traditional Western family, whether it be a chosen family. That's a big piece that's coming up now. Mm-hmm. And so that piece around the ancestor work in my book, I talk not just about biological family, I also talk about those relationships that form who we are. So I talk about lineage family, I talk about chosen family, I talk about all of those relationships. And really it's coming back into a sense of community, regardless of kind of how you build that community and what that community looks like, as opposed to individualism, where we're alone and we don't have that sense of connection.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, it's fascinating, Ben. I love it. What kind of response have you had on the book? What have you heard back from readers?
In the niche, actually, and I don't mind saying this, when I got my royalty check about a month and a half ago, the periods from September to December, I've sold over 1,000 books.
Wow.
It's pretty good.
That's great.
I have no sense, but it was like 967 books which is not bad for the first 4 months.
That's amazing. That's amazing. That's encouraging, right?
It is very encouraging. Yeah, it is very encouraging. One of the one of the pieces with this is, I when I was living in Hamilton, I was living with a priest of a particular spiritual tradition from Cuba, and the idea of the ancestors and other spirits in the world are always here, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the pagan kind of way of approaching things, particularly Wicca and neo-paganism, we often think of the dead as only relegated to Halloween. Right. And that's, the dead are always with us in the same way that spirits, angels, whatever other spirits you want to talk about, right? They're always potentially with us. And when we relegate kind of relationships to particular times of year, it's like, you only contact somebody on their birthday. That's it. You only contact them on that. That's not a relationship. That's lip service.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So the whole point of the book is to think about, again, that connection and that constant unfolding of that relationship. Because relationships change, relationships can grow, they can wane, but the relationship is always there because we're still actively kind of connecting with, right? But if we relegate it to only one time of year, then what we're actually doing is hurting ourselves, particularly around the dead, right? I don't really relish the fact of only being remembered at Halloween. Like, I'm not interested in that. When I eventually die, we're all going to die eventually, right? I don't really, I want my descendants, whether it be my chosen family or my, biological relatives, to still be remembering me afterwards. I want that connection still. And I imagine, depending on what happens on the other side of that veil, I'll still want to have an access point into life. Mm-hmm. Like, I still want to be part of the world. But to be just only thought about on those particular days, it's not, I'm not interested in that. So I was really trying to shift kind of pagan perspective on that, and it seems to be going good. Yeah.
Wow, it's exciting. That's encouraging. I like that. One thing also, we have authors that listen to the show then, and they're on a journey of writing. They're learning their craft. They would love to get inspiration from another author further down their path than they are. You and I, before we had record, we had a few things we wanted to kind of bring up in our conversation to benefit the authors. Totally. Can we kind of talk to them for a moment and encourage them? What are some of the things that you'd like to speak to them about around their author journey? And I know you had some suggestions for them as authors. Let's jump into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is my first book, and it just came out in September. I've actually just finished writing a whole other book for another publisher, and it's going to be coming out next year. Very different sort of book, though, but still part of the same process for me. So, I have a podcast myself, Essence. It's very niche, but it's particularly in speaking to other authors from the publishers that I work with and kind of in this sphere. And one of the resounding things that often we say, and I've heard this myself coming out of my own mouth, is that any book that we write, particularly nonfiction, but also fiction too, is always going to be a snapshot of who we were at that moment, right? When we're writing it, go 10 years and you'll be a very different person. You'll be a different writer, right? Yeah. So I often find that people will come to me and they want to know, tell me about your publishing journey. How do you get published? All that, right? And one of the biggest issues and hang-ups is they feel like they have to make it perfect. They have to absolutely make everything perfect the first go, especially if they've not gone through a writing process before. And I was the same per time. Like, I was the same. I had the same issue where I think with this one I spent about 8 months for an 86,000 word book. 8 months, which really isn't. I mean, for perspective, I just wrote 180,000 word source book in 3 months. Like, really evolution of writing process there. But the first one, it was because I was freaking out. I was constantly thinking, what do I need to do? How do I need to change this? I was editing as I went, all this and all the other. The cool thing with publishing, particularly a traditional publishing journey, is that you have editors who are going to help you with that. So the most important thing is to just get stuff down, put it down there, get your, because you're going to have other editing processes after that. Yeah, there's so many pieces. You're going to have to jump in and guide me on what we can talk about here. There's so many.
The one piece that we were chatting about before we record is just the whole idea about promotion and getting out there and talking about your books and opportunities that arise for you as authors. Some are beneficial, some are not quite as beneficial. So I'd like to kind of talk about that. You had some good examples about some possibilities for you to get out and speak and do some things. Just some guidance for authors who are maybe new to the promotion side of being about for their books as well. I'd like to kind of talk about that.
Well, and this is the thing, and I'm sure other guests of yours have said this as well. Writing the book is only probably about 40% of the whole work. Really, the whole work is in promotion, and nowadays you're expected to be branded, you're expected to have social media, you're expected to be a voice out there, right? And that is across the board. All genres of writing. I haven't heard any of the genres that, maybe cookbooks are the same. Yeah, cookbooks are the same. So it's one of those things where, coming into this, you have to figure out for yourself, what is it, why is it that you want to write this book? What is your motivation? Why do you feel like you need to put this book out there? Because there's vanity presses out there, and, there's that myth that everybody has a book out there, but it doesn't mean that it'll be successful, right? So you have to understand for yourself, what is your motivation and what is the intention with this? Once you understand that better, it will actually help you with the promotion, because then you'll be able to actually get into, okay, I know what my motivation is, I know what I'm intending with this, who am I intending it for?
Yeah.
So there's a couple of big pieces here. And this is even before you sit down to write the book. You have to know who your audience is. You have to know what your message is. This is for nonfiction, but also for fiction too. And you have to know who is going to be the best publisher to publish. I get, so I'm published with Ancestral Whispers. I'm published with Llewellyn International or Llewellyn Worldwide. It's one of the largest metaphysical publishing houses. You go into a metaphysical section at Barnes & Noble or Kohl's or wherever it is, and you'll often find Llewellyn books and Wiser books. Those are the two big ones, right? Now, everybody wants to be written by them. Everybody wants to be published by them because they're the biggest. But when you actually get into it, Llewellyn, Wiser, some of the other publishing, there's about 10 major publishing in this niche, in this field. They each cater to different segments of the market. And so if you have that knowledge of what type of book you're going to want to write, then approaching a publisher that fits with that market is going to be huge. Because if you mismatch that, if you go to a publisher that isn't going to be able to support you right off the gate because their audience is not that intended audience, then you're already shooting yourself in the foot. You're going to have to work even harder, right? So I often tell people, especially people who ask me, and I'm just a new author too. Like a lot of my colleagues in this field get asked the same question. I want to write a book. Tell me how to write a book. That is my first thing. Understand your audience and understand which publisher is going to be the best one. The second piece to that is understand that you're not going to write a perfect book. Very, very rarely do you write especially in certain genres, you're not going to write War and Peace right off the bat. You're going to have to build up to it. So, sorry, I'm losing my hands all over the place. That's why my microphone's going up. So, an editor of mine at Llewellyn gave me a very, very good suggestion. She said, you can always write another book. And this is the problem. People try to put way too much in. I was one. You try to put way too much into a single volume because perhaps, you're not succinct or you've got too many ideas or whatever the case is, right? And so what happens is the book starts to fall apart and the editor has even more that they have to do. So this idea that you have to get it right the first time, everything has to be in, is false. Because once you've started to gain that traction with an audience who is looking for your work, I found, and I've certainly found this now, like however many months outside, or 8 months since this came out, people are hungry for my next one because they like my writing style. I've gotten and I've engaged with them, right? So that's part of the promotion piece. You're the promotion piece, right? So So understand your audience, understand your publisher, understand what you want to do, and also understand that the limitations of that. And the fifth big piece around promotion um, is really knowing how to, right? A lot of people, it's very generational, unfortunately, don't know how to. But it's about connection. It's about relationship. One of the biggest things that I did, and I loved that. I love that I put the time and effort into this. Was I started a podcast where I interviewed other more established authors in this field, and what happened? They all liked me. It was wonderful. Like I, gained a lot of friends through this podcast. And I don't say that to sound like, oh, well, I only did it for friends. No, but they liked what I had to say with a really good conversation. And as part of that promotion piece, we were able to then cross promote. So, I have a friend who, and I'm not bragging here. Again, this is about relationship here, right? I have a friend who sold 200,000 copies of a book. Like he is one of the top tiers of his publisher, and he's incredible, and he's such a wonderful, humble individual. He's also gone through shit too.
Yeah.
Biking, people getting jealous, projections, all of these horrible pieces that also come with becoming a published author and becoming a public figure, right? But he was able to promote me, and I promote him, vice versa, right? And that was huge. That was really huge, right? So again, that relationship building is really big. However way you feel comfortable doing that, but get to know the other people who are writing in your field, become part of that community. And once you're accepted in that community, I feel like you'll see that then it'll become easier to promote, because not like in my particular niche, we all talk to each other. Most of the people that I know, we talk to each other, we swap notes, we take care of each other, or at least we hopefully take care of each other, right? And we're very quick to offer promotions and offer opportunities, right? I've been on probably about 70 after this conversation today, 70 podcasts since last spring.
Wow.
Right? Half of those are ones I've found, but half of those were, this author was a guest and is friends with this podcaster and in this very niche metaphysical community and suggested my name because they really liked my book, right? The endorsements that I got was because of that, right? This is another piece too around promotion. Start to think about who, particularly around nonfiction, sometimes fictions as well. I don't know too much about not like the fiction piece. I have friends who are writers in fiction. I assume that it's very similar. But start to think about, well, what are the authors and what are the names that you think somebody's going to open up the book, they don't know who you are, and look through and say, oh, this person, yeah, oh, what do they say? Okay, right? I had some fantastic individuals. I don't know if you know Professor Ronald Hutton.
No.
So Professor Ronald Hutton, his major niche is in witchcraft studies and paganism and history in the UK. Okay. You often see him on television, on these like BBC documentaries. Okay. He's a gentleman, like kind of longish hair and wanders around. He's a very cute individual. But he is sought after by everybody. He's, I believe, he's a commander of British he's got a CBE, so he's knighted by the king. And anyways, a huge individual, right? And I reached out to him and I said, Professor Hutton, this is a humble offering that I came up with. Would you be able to look at it and, would you offer a blurb? And within 2 days, he said, oh, Mr. Stimpson, I would be very pleased to, really, really classic British way. And I got an endorsement from Professor Hutton. And Professor Hutton is a superstar when it comes to the pagan community because he's one of the major people and historians who write on it. So I've heard people buy my book just because Professor Hutton put an endorsement in there, right?
Wow. And now you can do that for others too, as an author, right?
This is the thing. I actually have 3 other authors who've sent me their work in sitting in my mailbox, and I think I've blurbed. I think I've had the privilege to blurb. And this is the other thing too. It's a real privilege that when an author reaches out to you to say, would you blurb my book for me, right? Because not only is it a huge privilege knowing that you all, like those words are going to be read by whoever somewhere, right? They're going to know you, they're going to get to know you and they're going to get to know the actual author of that book. but it's one of those, it's that recognition piece. I trust you to have my book and tell the world what you think about it. It's incredible. That's part of coming into community. That's about supporting each other. Part of that promotion piece, right? We all promote each other. We all raise each other up, right?
It's great. It's a beautiful picture, Ben. I love that. I love it.
It's come with a bit of darkness. I've had the experience, unfortunately, where other authors, some of them have been originally friends of mine, who, because of, I'll just say it bluntly, when your light shines, sometimes other people become insecure about that because they fear that their light isn't going to shine as much.
Mm-hmm.
This, unfortunately, also happens in the author communities too. I'm sure that every single one of your guests and yourself have had this experience, right? They make themselves known, they undercut you, they try to dim your light, and unfortunately, sometimes people can take that and dim themselves, right?
Right.
It's unfortunate, but in the grander scheme, in building relationships within community, regardless of what genre you're writing in, the goal is to work towards that space of communication and connection, right? And that will lead into the final piece around promotion, which is sticking up for yourself and integrity. So one of the big things I learned was that oftentimes, at least in this niche, speaking events can take advantage of wanting you to freely speak about things because they want to monopolize that. They want to they want to work off of your work, right? So we see it again and again. Speaking events will suddenly be filled with all these new authors that have just had their new book come out. And all of them are doing it for free. All of them are usually paying, to attend the event or to travel to the event or whatever, right? And it's one of those situations where it becomes very predatory because that happens year after year after year, and that event takes in a lot of money, right? And I'm not picking on any one event. This happens all over the place. And so one of the big things around in being in community, in whatever genre you're working in, is you're going to get to know what are the quality events, the events that are going to respect you as an author, the events that are going to respect you and maintain certain standards that are going to make this enjoyable and raise everybody up. I have a friend, well, not a friend, he's a Facebook acquaintance, but he writes in the particularly kind of romance erotic fiction category, and he also is a photographer of imagery for front covers. So he's like taking pictures of really, really hot guys for these like romance erotic covers, right? And he's constantly going to signing events, and in that particular genre, most of them are independent writers. They're mostly, they're going through smaller publishers or they're self-publishing, right? And so these events are really big ways for them to sell their books. And he, of course, he's running around selling his own books, but also a lot of these guys who are on the front covers are there also just to enliven the event. And that community is really tight, and they know how to take care of themselves. They know how to take care of each other, their authors, and to demand certain expectations of events, right? And I think that if we do that more and more, and we educate each other, it helps again to raise the standards so that people aren't going to be preyed upon. And I see it again and again and again, particularly in the pagan community. We have, pagan pride events, for example, that will not offer a speaker fee. And this whole idea of doing it for the community, donating your time, all of this, well, I'm sorry, if it's going to cost me to come to your event to speak to a crowd of 15 people, then it's not worth my time.
Right.
Right. And those people who don't understand those boundaries, like affirming those boundaries, that might come across as ungracious and an arrogant thing to say. But at the end of the day, as authors, we have to, and as creatives in general, artists, musicians, whatever, we have to feed ourselves in order to perpetuate and support more content, right?
Yeah.
And I think that we need to speak out against that abuse. And speak out against that kind of mentality of, oh, well, somebody else will come along, you're irreplaceable. Well, that's the other thing my editor told me when I was first starting writing for them, right? Is that anyone can write a book on ancestor veneration, but only Ben Stimpson can write this book on ancestor veneration, right? I'm sure other authors have told you the same thing.
Yeah, I love it. And that's a great place to end off right there. I love that. For your website, Ben, and connections with you, maybe where we can find you online, where we can track you for speaking engagements, where we can come and meet you in person. Where do we go to get all information about Ben?
Everything is on benstimpson.com. You can find links there to my YouTube page, my Instagram page, my Facebook page. And I usually also have a listing on there around my podcast. So if people are listening to this within the kind of pagan metaphysical community, and are interested in writing a book in that, I have 72 episodes with people like Matt Oren, Devin Hunter, all of the big names are on there. And we often talk about writing as well in the writing process. So yeah, benstimpson.com.
I love it. We'll put a link to everything, including the podcast, because everyone, you need to go listen and share as well and let people know about it. But Ben, thank you again. I go back to the beginning of our conversation to meet someone who has connections with my family and my wife's family and all this. There's just, you're meant to meet great people in this world. And we're all on different paths, but sometimes they cross, and they cross in beautiful ways. And I'm always thrilled and excited that I get to meet someone like you. So thank you for a great conversation. I feel like I have to go let my brain rest a little bit because you've taken me down some great paths and I got some research to do. But thank you for doing this.
No, this was wonderful, and I'm really pleased that I was able to share about the writing process. That's a huge piece that I often don't get to talk about because I focus mostly on the content of the book. So to be able to talk about that was really wonderful. Thank you.
Excellent. If you need someone in your corner that you can ask questions of, and you want to meet Ben, go to his website. Reach out. I'm sure Ben would love to talk to you. Ben, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Hey, thanks for checking out the latest episode of Living the Next Chapter. I'm so happy to bring on these amazing authors and to share their stories, but I do have to confess I have a problem. And people who know me best would say, Dave, you have more than one problem. My problem is I have more episodes than I can release to you through my audio host, but I have a solution for you. Oh yes, head over to our YouTube channel, subscribe today to our YouTube channel, and you can get the most recent episode. I'm posting this episode today that I recorded today, and you can get it now on YouTube. Jump the line, move right past that big burly guy at the door. You can get right in and get the most recent episode of Living the Next Chapter on our YouTube channel. Make sure you go there. livingthenextchapter.com has all the information. And again, I want to thank you for making this podcast such a great joy to create. Catch you on the next one.